There's a trail in my town, hidden in plain sight. It's small, just a simple loop barely a mile long, and you can even see it from the freeway. Yet, strangely, almost no one I know has ever heard of it. My family has walked this trail for years, a quiet escape nestled in the trees. It feels like it's ours alone, untouched by time. But as ordinary as it seems, something about this place lingers in the back of my mind. A quiet unease I can't quite explain. Maybe some trails are forgotten for a reason. At first, the trail felt normal, just like it always had. But as my sister and I walked deeper, something changed. The air felt heavy. The trees seemed taller, their shape slightly wrong, as though we had stepped into a version of the trail that didn't belong. It wasn't fear, at least not yet, but a creeping unease that made us question every turn. The path twisted in ways we didn't remember, the familiar loop feeling endless. It was as if the trail itself was watching us, waiting for us to notice that we were no longer where we thought we were. The day had started like any other walk. My sister and I packed a couple of snacks and decided to spend a quiet afternoon on the trail. It was peaceful, as always. Birds chirping in the trees, the crunch of leaves underfoot. By the time we reached the small bench halfway through the loop, we were ready for a break. We sat down, unwrapped our sandwiches, and began chatting about everything and nothing. For a while it was perfectly normal. The kind of stillness that only comes from being deep in nature surrounded us, and there wasn't another soul in sight. But then, something changed. I noticed my sister tense beside me, her gaze darting to her leg. In an instant she jumped up, dropping her food onto the ground. At first I laughed, assuming a bug had startled her. That's what I told myself. It was probably a harmless spider or a leaf brushing against her skin. She didn't say much, just shook her head and mumbled something about needing to stretch. I didn't think anything of it at the time. It wasn't until later, after the walk, that she finally told me what had made her react like that. It wasn't a bug or a stray leaf. She swore she saw something, a small brown rodent crawling across her leg. But the strange thing was, the moment she jumped, it vanished. There was no rustle of leaves, no sign of anything scurrying away. It was as if it had never been there. She admitted she'd been trying to convince herself that it was just her imagination, a trick of the mind. After all, I hadn't seen anything, and when we both looked around, there was no trace of any animal. Still, I could see it in her eyes. She wasn't entirely convinced. We brushed it off as we continued the loop, laughing about how easily startled we could be. But looking back, I remember the silence that followed. The forest around us felt unnaturally quiet, like it was holding its breath. That wasn't the last time something strange happened that day. As we neared the end of the loop, just before the trailhead, we came across the small wooden bridge that crossed the creek. I paused, debating whether we should go around the loop again or call it a day. My sister was standing beside me, waiting for my answer, when I glanced at the bridge and saw, it was only for a second, but I know what I saw. A figure stood on the bridge, human-sized but wrong. Its head was shaped like a German shepherd's, its posture unnaturally stiff. My heart skipped a beat and I blinked. But in that instant it was gone. I laughed nervously, chalking it up to my imagination. But when I told my sister what I thought I'd seen, her face went pale. That's when she told me about the rodent. Neither of us had an explanation. But suddenly, the trail didn't feel so ordinary anymore. As we neared the end of the trail, the sunlight had started to fade. The golden hues of the late afternoon filtered weakly through the trees, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly across the path. The forest was eerily quiet now, the once lively chorus of birds and rustling leaves replaced by an unsettling stillness. My sister and I walked in silence, our earlier laughter and conversation fading with the light. We were approaching the small wooden bridge that crossed the creek, a familiar landmark near the trailhead. Normally, this part of the trail felt comforting, a sign that we were almost back to where we'd started. But today, the bridge looked different. The wood, weathered and darkened over years of exposure, seemed older somehow, as if it had been there far longer than it should have. The water beneath it trickled softly, but even that sound felt off, the rhythm irregular, and strangely hollow. I hesitated for a moment, letting my sister walk ahead slightly. Something about the bridge made me uneasy, though I couldn't quite put my finger on why. As I stood there, debating whether to suggest another lap around the loop, my eyes drifted to the center of the bridge, and that's when I saw it. A figure stood there, perfectly still, its shape framed against the fading light. At first glance, it looked human, its posture upright and motionless. But as my gaze focused, I realized something was terribly wrong. Its head wasn't human. It was shaped like a German shepherd's, elongated and sharp, with pointed ears that seemed to twitch ever so slightly. The fur was dark, almost blending into the shadows. But its eyes caught the light in an unnatural way, reflecting an eerie yellow glow that felt more like a predator's gaze than anything else. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt a chill run down my spine. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, but its presence was overwhelming. It felt as though it was watching me, not with curiosity but with intent, as if it had been waiting for us to notice it. I blinked, instinctively rubbing my eyes, and when I looked again, it was gone. The bridge was empty, the soft trickling of the creek the only sound in the stillness. My sister had stopped a few steps ahead, noticing my hesitation. She turned to look at me, her brow furrowed in confusion. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice breaking the silence like a crack of thunder. I hesitated, unsure of how to explain what I'd just seen. It sounded ridiculous, even to me. A dog-headed figure standing on the bridge? It had to have been a trick of the light, or maybe my imagination running wild after everything that had happened earlier. Still, I couldn't shake the image from my mind. I thought I saw something, I said finally, trying to keep my voice steady. On the bridge, it looked like, I don't know, like a person, but with a dog's head. She stared at me for a moment, her expression shifting from confusion to something else. Fear. "Are you serious?" she asked quietly. I nodded, my stomach sinking as I saw the look in her eyes. She believed me. Or at the very least, she understood that I wasn't joking. "You're not messing with me?" she pressed. "No," I said firmly. "It was there. Just for a second. Then it was gone." My sister's face went pale, and she glanced around the trail nervously, her shoulders tensing as if she expected something to jump out at us from the shadows. "That's really weird," she murmured. Especially after what happened earlier. She didn't need to elaborate. We both knew what she meant. The rodent she had seen on the bench, the unsettling feeling of the trail itself shifting beneath our feet. It all felt connected somehow, like the trail was trying to show us something we weren't meant to see. We stood there for a moment, neither of us wanting to cross the bridge but not sure what else to do. The silence pressed down on us, thick and heavy, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Finally, my sister broke the tension. "Let's just go," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't want to be here anymore." I nodded, and we started walking again, our pace quicker now, our eyes darting nervously to every shadow and rustling leaf. When we reached the bridge, I couldn't stop myself from glancing over my shoulder one last time. It was empty, just as it had been after the figure disappeared. But the unease didn't fade. If anything, it grew stronger, like the trail was watching us leave, making sure we wouldn't forget. By the time we made it back to the trailhead, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the forest was bathed in twilight. My sister and I didn't say much as we left, both of us too shaken to put our thoughts into words. But the image of that figure stayed with me, burned into my mind like a brand. What had I seen? Was it some kind of animal, distorted by the shadows and my imagination? Or was it something else entirely? Something the trail didn't want us to understand. Even now I can't explain it. Every time I think about it, I feel that same chill, that same sense of being watched. I haven't been able to shake the feeling that the trail isn't just a path through the woods. It's something more, something alive, maybe even aware, and that figure on the bridge? I don't think it was a coincidence. Whatever it was, it wanted us to see it. And I can't help but wonder if someday it'll be waiting for us again. We decided to go back to the trail a week later. I'm not sure why. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe we just wanted to prove to ourselves that it was all in our heads. This time we brought a friend along, a friend who didn't even know the trail existed. We thought her presence might make everything feel more normal. The walk started out uneventfully. The sun was shining, birds were chirping, and we spent most of the time laughing and joking about how we'd scared ourselves last time. We even told her about the strange sightings we'd had. The rodent, the dog-headed figure on the bridge. She laughed along with us, dismissing it as tricks of the imagination. For a while, it felt like any other walk, but as we neared the end of the loop, the air grew heavier. The laughter faded, replaced by a strange sense of quiet unease. None of us said anything about it, but I could tell my sister felt it too. Her steps slowed, her eyes darting around as if she was looking for something she couldn't quite see. Then out of nowhere, our friend spoke up. "Oh, look," she said, her voice bright with excitement. She pointed off to the side of the trail, into the shadows beneath the trees. I turned to follow her gaze, expecting to see a squirrel or a deer, something ordinary, but her voice faltered. "Wait, that's weird." She stopped walking, her finger still aimed at a spot between the trees. "I thought I saw a raccoon," she said, her tone confused now. It was standing up on its back legs, just staring at us. My sister and I exchanged a glance. My stomach dropped. "What do you mean, standing up?" I asked cautiously. "I don't know," she said, lowering her hand. It looked like a raccoon, but it was taller than it should have been. Like way taller. I swear it was just standing there watching us. But then I blinked and it was gone. Her words sent a shiver down my spine. It was the same pattern. The fleeting sight of something unnatural. There one second and gone the next. I looked at my sister again, and I could see the fear in her eyes. She didn't need to say anything. We were both thinking the same thing. We stood there in silence for a moment, staring at the spot our friend had pointed to. There was nothing there now, just the dense underbrush and the dark trunks of the trees. But the feeling remained, that unsettling sense that we weren't alone, that something was watching us from just beyond the edge of the trail. "Maybe it was just a trick of the light," our friend said eventually, her voice shaky. She tried to laugh it off, but it didn't feel convincing. We didn't linger after that. We quickened our pace, eager to leave the trail behind. But as we walked, I couldn't shake the thought. 3 different sightings, 3 different creatures. What were the odds? And why did they all vanish the moment we looked closer? By the time we left the trail that day, the air felt heavier than ever, like the forest itself was reluctant to let us go. None of us spoke much on the way back to the car, the silence between us laden with unspoken fear. Our friend tried to laugh off her sighting, but her nervous glances over her shoulder betrayed her unease. My sister and I didn't have the heart to tell her just how similar her experience was to ours. As we drove away, I kept replaying the events in my mind. 3 sightings, 3 creatures. Each of us had seen something different. Me, the dog-headed figure. My sister, the vanishing rodent. And now our friend, a towering raccoon. Each one had been there for only a blink, just long enough to register before disappearing. It didn't feel like a coincidence anymore. Even stranger was the sense of being watched, the feeling that the trail itself was aware of us. It was subtle, like a whisper at the edge of your hearing, but impossible to ignore once you noticed it. Every time I thought about it, I felt that same chill, like invisible eyes were still fixed on us even now. We haven't gone back to the trail since that day. None of us want to. Whatever is out there, whatever is tied to that trail, feels like it's more than just our imagination. It's waiting, watching, maybe even luring us back. I still wonder if we'll ever go again, if curiosity will eventually outweigh the fear. But deep down, I know one thing for certain. If we do, it won't be the same. Some trails are meant to stay forgotten, and I'm starting to think this one is better left alone.